Well, great. Well, let's go ahead and get right to it. I do have a few questions for you today. And so the first one is, what led you to start Hursley? And what problems were you attempting to solve?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's really based on the role that I've had in IT for really since my early 20s when I worked for small software development houses, where you sort of had to be a jack of all trades. I then moved to IBM and became an architect, and I was kind of drawn towards integration because I was an application developer. Wasn't particularly too interested in networks. I wasn't a business analyst, but the whole area of application integration drew me in. And just to show a little slide, I kind of wanted to answer the question by kind of working out where I fit in, which is kind of where I've always positioned myself, which is in between business and IT. I really enjoy the communication of working with the business and working out what the problem is and adding value, but also working with technical people. Um, and the kind of I realized that there is a gap between the the business team who are interested in business continuity and the kind of supporting infrastructure of networks and devices and things like that. And although I'm really interested in devices and technology at that level, it's the middle piece really, and I've called it service integration, but application development, um, database work, but especially integration. So how applications talk to each other essentially. Um, Especially working for IBM, where I work with IBM's MQ technologies and other middleware technologies, WebSphere and things like that. And as an architect in IBM, it's really where I learned to grow and to be able to draw really good architectural diagrams. That was one of the main parts of the job, was to articulate to different audiences, business and technical, what the solution was effectively, and you draw that as a picture. So I got good at drawing whiteboards, good at drawing Visio diagrams, PowerPoint. Um, but I sort of realized that I was becoming the problem because uh, it was complicated. And I'll just illustrate that with this picture. This is a simple view of the world, but essentially at a business level, there are assets and there are schedules and processes and there are people, and they all kind of talk to each other at that level. And you could view a business just at that business level. At a application level, there's data, there's applications, and there's kind of the flow of data between applications, very simplistically. And then you've got underpinning infrastructure, devices, whether virtual or physical these days, locations or cloud-based, and networks, which also talk together. And my view really was that people tend to focus in on certain domains. So there are people who specialize in the network domain, there are business analysts, but there weren't that many people who sort of crossed the two, and I found that really interesting. And especially when I was trying to draw diagrams that were communicating to a business what options there were, or how we move forward, or how we design a new solution. And being an architect, it's a lot about looking forward and producing a vision for the future, and drawing a diagram to represent a future vision is relatively straightforward, but you're selling a concept. But I realized that, I'll just move forward a little bit, that the connections between these things, and essentially the business is dependent on data and applications. The users use applications, but the data sits on infrastructure and the applications sit on infrastructure, and they all sort of talk to each other. And it gets complicated, and it was getting no less complicated. Things were getting more complicated, and it's a challenge, I'll admit, to understand enough about the end-to-end solution to articulate it. The problem became, though, because I was good at drawing diagrams, that was my job, you tend to be believed that you know everything about how systems work, and it's sort of impossible. So there's quite a lot of pressure at that stage. Um, my only advice with this sort of view, which I've sort of taken ever since, is I do tend to start in the middle. So have a look at an inventory of the data, the schemas, the applications, the integrations work, but also do a top-down and a bottom-up analysis, because things are joined together. And the challenge that I found, that this sort of view of the world isn't really very well documented in organizations, how everything fits together, which means when a change is needed, the effect isn't really known until it's too late, and decisions are based on misinformation or based on diagrams that are out of date. Um, and I realized that visualization held the key. So I used a lot of modeling tools and drawing tools as a way to visualize things, but again, it was limited by my knowledge about how things fitted together. And just as a bit of a backstory as well, I realized that the reason integration is difficult is because over the years we've introduced more complexity to systems. Systems have grown, and the integration between them, the data flows between them and between organizations, is now more complicated than it ever was. And I had a bit of a, I suppose, epiphany is the word, but the realization that drawing diagrams isn't the only way to do things, especially when you're looking at the way current state systems work. And a lot of focus when you do designs and architectures is on the new system, and a lot of vendors push for new solutions, which is fine. But the challenge is that it's done in sort of ignorance of how the current system works and what the effect will be and what will have to change with the current system. And I like this term that I came across from another IBMer that I worked with, a senior IBMer who's now retired, the term of brownfield development as opposed to greenfield. And most projects that I've worked on, bar a few, very few, are brownfield. So you're building on existing technology rather than building in a greenfield. So understanding current state and the way that works, I realized was something that I was really interested in, and other people weren't that interested in. So I decided that I'd make that my sort of focus. And looking forward, it won't get any easier. Basically, the rate of change won't decrease. If anything, it will increase. But the same challenges are there in that we need to build systems that are trusted and available, and expectations are increasing. It's getting more and more complicated. So the challenges that I had and have had over the years will get even more challenging. The ability to draw how everything works based on me understanding everything is a challenge. And I think it's fundamentally important that we do understand things, so that I always like to think of how a future version of myself would react if they looked at some of the diagrams that I drew. You sort of want to leave that behind, but they're flawed by the fact that they're not easy to maintain. So this idea of a data-driven approach really started to grow in me. This is kind of a quick summary of it's saying that really there's always an alternative. I'm not suggesting that data-driven is always the way to go. I think starting with a picture is it still has a great deal of value, but my view is that it's not the only approach. I think it's a good approach when you're looking at future state, when you've got a number of individuals who've got knowledge. You can draw whiteboards, you can produce models. You're basically drawing the diagram based on your view. This could be the current state, but my suggestion is that that sort of diagram is reserved for future state, because you're kind of painting a picture moving forward. And my recommendation is not to try and draw current state, because it changes too much. By the time you've drawn the current state, even if it's a good representation of current state, tomorrow it's different. Whereas a future vision is something that you're aiming towards. So it can be a little bit more abstract. So this was really the starting point, probably 17, 18 years ago, just a couple of years after I came to New Zealand 20 years ago, to put the effort into building some technology. And after a couple of speed bumps, I came across Tom Sawyer Software. So and we've been partners ever since. So that's the kind of distinction in my mind, that starting with a picture and drawing a whiteboard or using PowerPoint is fine for future state, because it sets that view, it sets that goal. But for current state, find something that's data driven. There's a number of ways to do that. So I was trying to summarize today my vision for HubScope, which I've tried to summarize as, well, essentially provide a sophisticated understanding of the current state independencies between different parts of an organization and between organizations, focusing on data at rest and data in motion. And the data is very important, because if the data didn't exist, you wouldn't be able to draw the visualizations. And there's some lessons learned from some of the approaches I've got so far, and we're sort of readjusting the roadmap, which I'll come on to. And just a case in point, this is a case study, sort of one of our best case studies here in New Zealand. The Ministry of Justice, which is it basically sits within, it's a New Zealand ministry, central government agency, connected to the police force, corrections. The court system is quite sophisticated, and there's a lot of systems, obviously, that connect to each other, and they connect to other people's systems. One of the examples that I was told was when there's a court hearing, then information has to go to the corrections department to release the prisoner and be accompanied to the courtroom. And if there are problems with that, and there were problems, then it can cost quite a lot of money because you have to dismiss the judge, and the jury have to go home for the afternoon. So little integration problems of synchronizing all of these things together can cause big disruptions and expensive. So these are some stats from New Zealand statistics. New Zealand's quite a small country, but we've still got a fair share of crime and trouble. There's another diagram that I found. Oh, and sorry, the challenge with the project, this was back in 2017 when I sort of walked in the room when they were trying to solve this problem, was they were trying to upgrade, or they're on the brink of upgrading their legacy integration platform to an Oracle integration platform. And so they were basically trying to solve these problems that occurred in terms of security and broken integrations. And it was complicated because it had developed over time. This is sort of a simpler view, which shows the dependencies between the court proceedings and the number of people who are prosecuted and the number of fines. It's a very high level view, but essentially behind this, there's a whole lot of applications that sit within justice that talk to each other. So the case study was focused on upgrading the integration platform. It was really too difficult to understand all of those relationships when looking at them in a table. And an organization called Datacom, who are a services organization, had gathered all of the information about the applications, the integrations, the servers, and they were trying to draw that by hand based on the spreadsheet. And it's a very difficult thing to do. So it was perfect timing to walk through the door and plug in HubScope. We did some mapping to their spreadsheet because it was their spreadsheet, and I think everybody was surprised at what the visualization looked like, because it did it very quickly, and it just converted it into a graph, basically. A bit of some statistics. There's about 300 nodes, which consist of servers, applications, and messages and things, and about 500 relationships. The success for this, it's been running there for 5 years, so they've renewed every 5 years. They've just renewed, is the sort of partnership between HubScope providing data-driven visualization, Datacom, who are the services partner who manage the data on behalf of the Ministry of Justice. And the key there is if they weren't managing that data, the diagram would be just the same as if somebody had drawn the diagram. It wouldn't be dynamic. And that feedback loop that they get from seeing the data visualizes and sharing that data with the different parties means that they take good care of the data that goes in the spreadsheet. So it's a great way to emphasize the value that the spreadsheet's adding. It's not a spreadsheet. It's not ideal that it's in a spreadsheet. They're talking about moving that into a database, which we're also aligning to. And Fujitsu, who are the reseller into government. So within government in New Zealand, you have to have a sort of partnership agreement with the government, which HubScope don't have. And so we partnership with Fujitsu in New Zealand, and they do the annual license renewals, which has actually strengthened the relationship because they look after the sort of account management. And they Ministry of Justice paid Fujitsu, they pay me, I pay you. It's a nice little partnership. There's a couple of observations from this. It's not, I realize it's not actually a common enough problem. It's certainly a problem that exists, but it's not something that's top of mind for people. I think they know that they would like to see maybe a better view of their integration, but because it's working, unless there's some catalyst that causes them to review it, which would mean you'd have to know about that opportunity, then it's not really a good strategy. So it's not something we're focusing on. We still provide this, but the problem is that the success of the project is dependent on somebody maintaining the data source, which isn't HubScope. We're not a services team. We've decided not to be a services team, to be a product team. We do consultancy, but we don't have a large services team. And typically an organization, although I might argue that they should do this sort of audit themselves of how things fit together, they typically don't. So there's usually a partner involved. So that's an ingredient anyway, that somebody has to own the data. And that's a challenge with visualizing data integration, because there isn't a ready source available of how integration works. It's usually very complicated, or it's in different places. But the good thing is that once it was working, they didn't want to switch it off. So that's a good thing. But it's a timing question. This is what the integration looks like. It's very high level. But basically you can see what it looks like when it draws using the orthogonal view, and this is from a spreadsheet. And it was visualizing this that really sealed the deal, if you like. When we were in that meeting, they could see that they couldn't have drawn this manually. And when we also show I'll show you some of the interactions that you can do with a graph like this. It just solved that problem that they were having of having to manually maintain this. And it was really a sell to Datacom who were trying to do this. And we then both presented to Ministry of Justice, who bought the HubScope license. And it really hasn't changed too much since that first configuration. We've added new features, but the structure of the source table hasn't changed. They've just been adding and taking away different components. They've gone live. They went live with the system about 2 years ago. The upgrade took about 3 years. It was quite a big project, but they're now using HubScope to operationally monitor the system. We're in discussions around how we can use real-time events to elaborate this sort of view so that you can see if something's down or something's not working. And they're also now talking about refactoring this whole integration platform and going out to tender for another integration partner, which is typically what people do. And it sort of emphasizes the point that any new system that a company builds will become legacy at some point. So it's a moving target. So constantly understanding your current state. If you don't start to understand your current state now, it will get more complicated in the future. So now is a great time to sort of think about how you might do that. Yeah. It was complicated, but one thing that really held this together was the view that behind it's quite simple. So we've got different perspectives here, which means that different parts of the business or different people can look at that graph in different ways. So that there's a business view, there's an infrastructure view, there's a technical view, which is the applications, and then you can view everything. Because typically if you show everything to everybody, it can be a little bit intimidating. But if you show just the business processes to the business team, then they can see where they fit. And I like that word perspective, because everybody gets their own view of things, and actually they can see other people's views of things, which is also good. They are also using it for DevOps. This isn't their data; it's just an example. But they've got basically their technical lead had challenges justifying the sort of resources they would need to manage their systems. So they had people with skills, applications with technology, and only by mapping it together, and he had a spreadsheet, but he used HubScope to visualize that, to really show the management, we've got some deficiencies in these areas, we've got some projects that need some visual basic skills, and it kind of emphasized the data that he already had, but the same ingredient, somebody was maintaining the data. But I quite like that, a much smaller scale graph, but it allowed them to look at organizational structures, and they put their team's faces in here just to make it a little more relatable, and the relationships between the team and the applications and the skills, developers, engineers. This is a demo version of what they were doing, and also what projects were delivered. And again, behind that, there's a simple schema that we've developed, and that was one of the approaches with HubScope, was to make it as generic as possible that you could configure with a different environment. So we've got a number of templates for different things. So that's what sort of sparked me, my career in development, and then working for IBM as an integration architect. I think coming to New Zealand gave me the space to think about this and decide to do something about it, really. I'd love to say it was easy, but it wasn't. It was, there's been some challenges to get all of this to work, but the vision sort of has held me going. It kept me going, and the vision really hasn't changed to make it simpler for people to understand how their systems work, and actually the clients themselves to understand that, rather than the partners they're working with, to try and give them the realization that although they realize they should take responsibility for that, there are mechanisms that they can put in place where they can start to manage their own data and visualize how things work. So be less dependent on their vendors understanding how their systems work, and take control over some decisions that they're making. Yeah.
Oh, great. Thank you, Steve. That was very helpful to hear all that. So I have another question for you. What opportunities does visualization provide, and what challenges does it address?
Yep, good question. I started to think about this as the features within HubScope, but I just thought I'd take a step back and just look at the benefits as I see them. I think the first one, which is quite significant, really, is that when people look at a diagram that's been drawn using data, they sort of get drawn into it because they know that it reflects reality. And even if, I mean, I've shown some visualizations where the data was wrong, but even in that situation, they look at the graph and they can immediately see, they'll comment on it. They'll say, well, that integration between those two systems was decommissioned a year ago. Why is it still on the diagram? And because I'm not drawing the diagram as an architect using PowerPoint or Visio, I draw the diagram. You don't get defensive when that sort of comment comes because I didn't draw the diagram. I'm simply using a tool to draw a diagram based on the data. So you don't have to defend the diagram. So actually, there's value in seeing that the connection is wrong because we can then go back and correct the data. It gets more personal when you feel you need to know everything about everything and the diagram is criticized. It's a different, it takes the pressure off, if that makes sense. But because the trust is there, I think people make sounder decisions because they're basing it on a diagram that is drawn based on data they're managing rather than a person's knowledge. You still need people's knowledge, but with this sort of thing, you tend to be too dependent on individuals to know too many things, which is unreasonable, I think. Yeah. I think it also provides a non-threatening view of information. If you provide somebody with a table that shows all of the integrations, it's very difficult. It's difficult to spot the relationships. We don't naturally, as humans, read that and then draw a picture in our heads. We often stand up on a whiteboard and try and draw things when things are kind of muddled together and it's not straightforward. So it's non-threatening. People are drawn into it, and that sort of leads into this ability to have different perspectives. So you can show that in different ways, which I think is really solving one of the key problems that technical projects have, and the reason some fail is there isn't empathy between the teams. So the communication between technical teams is working quite well. The business is working quite well, but they're not talking to each other because they're using a different language. Whereas a diagram is a good way to cut through that because it's nice and simple, and it's great to see business and technical people lean forward and look at Tom Sawyer visualizations. And I've had occasions where they've said, oh, wait a minute, stop, make it do that again, because it's drawing the layouts in a way that they almost didn't believe was possible, and they just want to see it again. So it's kind of a magical thing when you see that happening, and it gets everybody engaged. It gets people kind of talking to each other because it's the same shared system. They're seeing the same system from different angles, different perspectives, and also storytelling. So you can kind of run through scenarios. You can focus on a specific particular path or a particular integration, and you can see, well, what has happened. There might have been an outage, like the court system going down, or you might be looking at options for moving forward, in which case you can pick an application. Maybe it's the finance system, and the plan is to upgrade that, and you can kind of jiggle it, or we've got a function called Ripple, which will show the dependencies around that. And then you can kind of see that, well, we can't just make a decision to replace that system in the next month. It's talking to too many other systems. Let's plan for that to occur after we've done these other things. So you can kind of tell a story and go through scenarios in a very informed way rather than a more subjective way, or a way that's influenced too heavily by vendors who are peddling their particular solution as being the answer to all your problems. Not to knock vendors, but the company themselves everybody needs to be aware of the impact of the change. And like I said, that brownfield and greenfield, it's always important to understand what you've currently got. Yeah. And the last one is really to conceptualize and contextualize complexity. It's a bit of a mouthful, but it is a lot to take in. Organizations are very complicated, and they're not getting any less complicated. Even small organizations, we're doing some work at the moment with county councils, and their IT systems have developed over the past 30, 40 years. They've got people who worked for the council for 30, 40 years, a lot of inbuilt knowledge, but they're very busy, and there isn't really anything written down about how things work. And although they're trying to modernize and move towards a digital city, it's very difficult to modernize because they've got this legacy of applications, often physical hardware, but even in the cloud, it's complicated to change things because everything's talking to each other, and it's very hard to make decisions when you don't understand the effect of change. Yeah. So the features, I've listed them here, but we've also got some demos. I'll quickly go through those. There are quite a few of them, but I think it's important to show them, and they're in no particular order. But the first one is the kind of most important one. This is certainly the one that drew me to Tom Sawyer Software, because I've tried to write the algorithms that do this, and they're not easy. But it's effectively layouts. It's the ability to take a graph and to look at it from different ways. So there's orthogonal, hierarchical, a bundle layout, circular. And by drawing these views in these ways, your eye is drawn to certain things, and the layouts lend themselves to different types of network. The hierarchical is good for organizations. Orthogonal is really good for network views and application views. But you can kind of play with it and see, well, let's have a look at this. And even with this, your eye is drawn to nodes which are connected to lots of things. And that does change with the different views. So layouts is a great one. The ability to, with a large complex graph, especially like the one at Justice, to have a little overview view, so we can zoom in and zoom out and still see the big picture while zooming into the content. And all of these demos are demo data. Yeah, so that's really, really useful. Hover over is sort of fairly trivial, but it just means you're not showing everything on the screen at once. You can zoom into a node and just hover over it, and it'll give you a little pop-up. We are plan to work with one of the features in Tom Sawyer Software, where when you zoom in, the level of detail starts to get elaborated. So when you zoom out, it's a tiny colored dot, but when you zoom in, you get quite a detailed view. Filters is effectively choosing what you see. So if you have a large graph, and we've sort of coded it in so that it works a bit like a spreadsheet. You can filter everything, and then you can switch things on and off. The filters apply to types of nodes or attributes or relationships, and by switching things on and off, things will disappear from the graph, and you can then use the layouts to redraw. So it's sort of taking out the noise from the graph. This one is sort of very relevant to an integration system, even though this is showing IP information or port information, in that there'll often be a lot of connections between two things. So with integration, a lot of data flows between two applications, which is fine, but sometimes you really just need to know that there are data flows between the two applications. You don't need to see the detail, but the ability to switch the two, which I've called merge edges, it lets you do that. Yep, it's a way to simplify things and potentially not overload somebody who's not interested in all of the different types of connections. They just want to see the big picture. Yep. And the good thing is all of these things can all be merged together. So you can combine all of these different features together, and it feels much more like a toolbox than anything else, really. Yeah. Navigating links is kind of in line with the storytelling. So we're having a conversation with somebody and we want to work out what the change was. Maybe somebody's changed something. Well, which person changed it? We can walk around the links and navigate them. I think this is especially good if you're in a workshop and you're doing some facilitation, and it's one of those things that gets people leaning forward and kind of being interested in a graph. And this is something that you couldn't do with a PowerPoint presentation or a Visio slide. Context is an interesting one. This is building upon the idea of perspectives, where we've got different tabs at the top, which if you switch between, it shows different views of the world. But the idea with context is that whatever I do, if I click a certain node like this person, and then I go to another tab, it will highlight the same person. So by looking at the person on one tab, which might be the organizational chart, then I look at another tab that's showing who last changed the API, then I don't have to re-find the person. It keeps them in context. So it moves everything around based on that one thing I'm looking at, including the table view that appears at the bottom here in a second. So whatever I select, it will zoom into the graph with context. Yeah, that's really good. It's a simple feature, but it's really powerful. Searches, as you might expect, you have a large graph and you just need to find something. It'll find all the possibilities, and I can zoom into them and just selectively click them and find which one's the right one for me. Discovery is something that we developed with some code extensions, if you like. So it wasn't a pure deliverable, a pure configuration using the configuration files in Tom Sawyer Software, which is the very quick way of doing things. This was a little bit more sophisticated, and the idea here is, rather than seeing the whole graph at once, we want to start with a certain start point and then expand the graph from that start point. So if I just let it get back to its start point. And you can do it in two ways. You can either find something on the large graph and then say discover, and it will jump to a new tab and show everything related to the thing you've discovered. Or you can start with a search. So if I type in camera, it'll find all the cameras. And if I highlight the cameras I'm interested in and discover those, it shows me everything that's related to those cameras. So it's a slightly different approach to showing everything at once. It's more of a, well, let's just ignore everything. What we're actually interested in today is this particular integration between these two applications. So let's find them both and see how they're connected. Cluster is something I really like, I must admit, which is where you've got lots of information. You think back to the Ministry of Justice graph, but you don't want to see that information. You want to collapse it down using either the types of things that you're looking at or attributes of the things that you're looking at. So you might group it down by the security domain or the confidentiality of the data, or when it was last changed, whatever it might be, or the value of the licenses you're paying. But clustering takes a graph like this, and it will then combine things into little groups, and then we can collapse those groups down. And we've put some counts in there so that you can see that there are 7 applications. So if we drill down into that cluster, you can see the actual applications, and you can click on these and drill in and drill out. We added to this a few years ago a concept called tiering, and this was prompted by one of the sample templates that you have, and it's kind of akin to an architectural technique that I've used before, where you're trying to draw a hierarchy of relationships between things. So you're showing sort of things stacked on top of one another, and the idea of tiering is it builds on the cluster effect, but it means I can cluster everything down to a single thing and then drill down into a particular thing. So this demo is for a smart home, but I could drill into a particular thing, and this is especially good when you're talking to a stakeholder who isn't interested in the large picture. They just want to see the effect on their application or their business unit. But yeah, by clustering like this way and then switching into it's basically a cluster which knows about the hierarchy. It knows that rooms are in buildings and buildings are in cities, that sort of thing. So you have to tell it that. But once you tell it that, these graphs come for free. I mean, that's the value of having something which is generic. If the data changes, all of these graphs change. It's great. Because there isn't enough time in the day for me to draw diagrams all day. That's basically the conclusion I came to. It's that there are more interesting things to do. And unfortunately, other people share the view that there are more interesting things to do than draw diagrams all day. Some people do get defensive when you show this, but that's fine. It's yeah, it's not. It causes a reaction sometimes, but generally they can see that this will just save them no end of time, and especially in terms of accuracy, they can then have conversations which are based on facts rather than subjectivity. Ripples is the one I was mentioning, where you want to see, well, what's the effect of changing something, and you can click on one or more things and then see what the ripple is. And if it's one or more thing, it'll show you the intersection between those two things. So how are these two things related? Because they may not be directly related, but something that they both talk to might be related. And this would be good for looking at the impact of a change. So we're planning to bring down this server. Will this server affect the court system? Will it affect an application that's providing a service for the court system? And you might plan to do that out of hours if that's the case. Paths is a standard feature. So this is basically picking 2 nodes and seeing how they're related. And you can find a path in a number of ways. So the shortest path, a path based on an attribute. So maybe find me all the secure connections between these 2 things. And then by finding the paths, you can redraw the layout and yeah, again, have a conversation around that. And the paths is quite a good one that you can combine with the ripples. So I could say find the path between these 2 nodes, and then I could say, well, show me all of the ripple on all those nodes, and it will show me all of the nodes connected to anything on the path of those 2 nodes. So you can sort of see the bigger picture. Yeah. And it's combining these things, I think, that's the powerful thing. Delta is something that it's not particularly a Tom Sawyer thing, but it's leveraging visualization as a way to show differences. So with all of the clients who use spreadsheets, they can import 2 spreadsheets, 1 or 2, but if they provide 2, then as part of the conversion to a graph internally, it takes those 2 imports and compares them, and using the results, it will say whether this thing's been deleted, it's new. So here you can see there's a cross, so that relationship has been removed, yet all of these things have been added. So and this was one of the things that I think has caused Justice to continue using the product, because they had a third-party service partner doing the development, but they had an internal test team. Whenever anything changed on an integration, the first thing the internal test team would do was to look at the delta between the last release and this release, and they could see they've changed this integration path, so we need to do a regression test on this integration path. Whereas doing that with 2 spreadsheets and trying to compare what's changed on a spreadsheet, because the changes were quite extensive, it's really difficult, if not impossible. So this was, it wasn't that straightforward to get this working, but that doesn't matter. The actual outcome is a really simple thing to use, and you can view the old graph, the new graph, or the differences between the 2. That's effectively it. We're moving away from this spreadsheet approach, but the same feature of comparing points in time, and it could be comparing the past with now, or 2 points in the past, or now in the future. There's quite a lot of possibilities with this, but you're basically comparing things in order to highlight a difference, which we've called a delta. Yeah. And the last one, I think, is swim lanes, which is a relatively new feature, I think, to Tom Sawyer Software. And it kind of builds upon the graph idea, but you can introduce a swim lane effect. So we nominate 2 attributes, and the user can pick which 2 attributes to use across the X and Y axes. And it still plots the relationships between the nodes, but it puts them in swim lanes. And by filtering on and off the swim lanes, as you can see here, you can sort of see where things fit. This lends itself well to, I think, things like project management, where you're looking at the timeline of things, the interdependencies between things, and there are dependencies on a timeline and on a team resource perspective. So who's doing what and when? You can sequence this in various ways like that. But again, because it's drawn using data, the conversations you have about decisions are made on much firmer ground, because it's based on the data that's come from somewhere. And I've always taken the line that where the data comes from isn't my responsibility. I can help the client work out where that source data comes from. And that's one of the challenges, to be honest. The biggest challenge with data visualization is, where does a trustworthy source come from? I don't really mind what format the source is. It could be a database, a spreadsheet, an API. And one of the features that we've used within Tom Sawyer is just to federate from different sources, so that we're really not making that an obstacle. We're not telling the client where their data should be stored. We're simply mapping to it. We're not trying to change too much, because they're currently maintaining the data. So that opens up the possibilities. But the challenge with data integration is that the data isn't really anywhere. It's in lots of places. It's usually not managed well in one place. Which brings me on to some of the insights that we've got. But so that's just a quick run through of all the features. I know there's a lot to take in there, but it shows you the leverage that we've managed to make with the tool set that Tom Sawyer has provided. Yeah.
Thank you, Steve. This has been very helpful, and it's always nice to see different types of visualizations and hear more about the different use cases of where different visualizations are useful and effective. I have another question for you. So what predictions do you have for the future of system integration and data migration?
Yep, that's a good question. I'm not usually good on predictions, but I gave it a go. So I think, like I said, things will get more complicated. I think it's inevitable that systems, be it process and data and applications and infrastructure, will get more complicated at all those levels. For organizations to compete, for governments to stay relevant and add value to their citizens, to protect their citizens, to protect their borders. There's all sorts of things where the systems are actually becoming more sophisticated. It's inevitable that the future is going to be more complicated than the past in that respect. And there's no end of choice that we have for new applications and systems, and that will continue. But no matter how complicated it becomes, I firmly believe that we always need to know how things work. We can't ever not know how our systems work. And I think systems will remain multifaceted. In other words, different component parts that people can choose from, rather than one solution that runs the whole organization. I know there is a bit of a tendency towards that, but I think that's really limiting choice. I think for certain parts of an organization it makes sense, but I think on the whole, especially if you think of a county council or somewhere like the justice system, they've got so many different parts of the organization and it's so specific. There isn't really one solution that will come and do everything. And I'm not going to name an application that claims to do everything, but there are big applications out there, large platforms, but they tend to be generic, and they're very expensive to customize, and they're very expensive to buy. So on the whole, I think organizations who pick best of breed applications for certain things is the right choice, because you can then make different choices in the future. But the integration will need to be there, and understanding how your current state works is going to be more important than ever, because they won't stay the same. You'll have to change components. I think automation, which is a hot topic at the moment, I think is definitely improving efficiency of people. It's improving my efficiency of writing SQL, because I can just go in there and very quickly get the answer I need, but I have to know to ask the right question. It's obviously going to disrupt jobs. So there's impacts that we can see in New Zealand on that at the moment. Especially in government, for instance, policy advisors and things like that. There's concern over what automation could do. I fundamentally believe, though, that even though AI is good, it doesn't have all the answers just yet, and I don't think it ever will. And the reason I say that is the thing that AI doesn't have is contextual knowledge about how an organization works and the little nuances that they've got and the gut feelings that they've got. So that's the source of information that I'm interested in, and I think it's a relatively untapped knowledge base, really. How do you capture that from people's heads? That's something we're working on now. I think it's the next slides. We're working with and the last one is that human interfaces will have to become more enhanced and advanced and natural, which is why I want to continue working with Tom Sawyer Software. I wouldn't want to build that myself, and so working with partners who specialize in that sort of advanced interface is absolutely something to build on. We're working with a partner in the UK. I just put this slide in just as a bit of sideline, but it's this. The challenge we've got at the moment is when we're working with organizations, we can point to their databases and we can look at application inventories, but a lot of the knowledge about how systems integrate with each other is in people's heads, and it's quite a trick to gather that out of people's heads and keep it fresh and up to date. And the way to do that isn't with AI. It's by tapping into the knowledge that they've got, and I think one of the keys to that is giving them something of value. So not just having an interview with them, but actually then giving them the results that they can see. So we're working with an organization in the UK. It's called Focus Facilitation. It's essentially a technique for gathering that information into a set of structured lists, and we're visualizing those lists. So we're working on something for the new year whereby in an actual facilitation session, as people are talking and the information is captured, we draw the graph as they go. So the visualization of them describing how the system works is growing all the time as they see it. And then they will start to trust that that is now the source of truth. It may not be correct, so they can correct it, but it's providing a context that can pin everything else together. So it can pin the list of applications together and the other things that we can discover by adding business context. That's the missing thing that I've got from my graphs is business context. So I'm really excited about this, and I'll keep you posted on where we get to with that. But it again builds upon visualizing that data and the fact that by seeing relationships between things is valuable to just about everybody. Yep.
Yeah, definitely. Oh. So what's next for you and Hursley?
Yep, I've got a little slide for that, a little roadmap. It's quite high level. It's effectively doing the same thing. So sticking to the vision of making it easy to understand current state. think it's good to focus on that. So I decided almost at the start of all of this that we wouldn't build a modeling tool. We're not building something that lets you draw diagrams using the tool like a modeling tool. It's pretty much drawing everything from data. I think there is a case for making it so you can edit the data in the diagram, but I think essentially most of the data comes from somewhere else and we map to it, which is the key to understanding current state. We're focused on main problems, so we're still focusing on data integration, but we're putting a lot of focus at the moment based on 2 recent projects on data migration, because it's got the same challenges of, if you knew the dependencies between the systems, the old legacy system and the new system, then it would de-risk the migration projects. And pretty much every migration project I've worked on has had risk all over it, and they've failed in some way, sometimes dramatically. So by I've got a slide that shows what I mean there, but by providing tools and an approach towards data migration, which starts with understanding what the source data is, so profiling the data in databases, what the impact of change is across systems as you integrate and change things, and making it a focus point. So using visualization to make data migration understood by business stakeholders and getting them engaged, because a lot of the value in a good data migration project comes from engaging with business stakeholders and giving them the option to do things in different ways and be involved in business data cleansing decisions rather than just a pure technical exercise to do data migration. So it's a big thing for us at the moment, data migration. The data integration is still there, but I actually think by helping customers do data migration and understand their current sort of static data, will then provide a platform for understanding how data flows between systems, because they'll suddenly have an understanding of where their data is at the moment. And data architecture in organizations, much like data integration, is something that very few organizations have, in my opinion, a good handle on. Very few companies have a data architect or a diagram of the data components, or it's usually lots of databases spread around, and it's difficult to get a high level view of that. So automation can do that by reading the metadata and visualizing it. So we've got some work on that's coming out in the new year. It's something that I potentially haven't done in the past, because the first version was built on my ideas, but what we're really doing now is build every version of HubScope based on client feedback. And by focusing on the specific problem of data migration and only working on data migration projects now, we're getting a lot of feedback around how we could enhance the product. And we've got some beta versions of the visualization being available in the new year. So make it an inherent part of the company to always listen to what the client wants, basically. And that's the roadmap. We are going to look at using a knowledge graph to store things, so that when we snapshot information, that timeline thing, we're not just looking at 2 spreadsheets, we're actually profiling data. It could be every day, it could be every hour, and we can then we can then visualize how the data is changing over time, and we can compare points in time. And I'd like to introduce the idea of machine learning, so that experts can look at it and they can improve it based on the combined data and knowledge, but also natural language processing, whereby you can type in a question and the answer will come back as a visualization. We're introducing a publish subscribe, so you can actually register interest in a certain event or alert. So for example, tell me if this integration between these 2 applications doesn't work in the next few weeks. If it's not sending across the payroll information every Tuesday evening, let me know. Or if this graph changes, let me know. Or if the data structure in this schema changes, let me know. Or if the schema between test and production changes, so somebody introduces a new field to test, but it's not in production, whatever it might be, you're registering interest, and then the visualization would show you the difference when that occurred. I think that's a very powerful thing. I'm basically storing all of the metadata around data at rest and data in motion, so that we can analyze a timeline view of that and monitor for changes. I think that's going to really enhance the engagement of users, and continue to leverage partner technology and your R&D efforts. So Tom Sawyer Software. That's it.
Oh, okay. Oh, great. Well, thank you. We always appreciate the opportunity to work with you, and it's really nice to see the visualizations and the different types of use cases. There's many different types of things that HubScope helps your customers to do. So my next question to you is, what if there are people who want to find out more about HubScope? What do they do?
Yep, two things. I can make these slides available, and there's a couple of slides we've got on what we're doing next, which is I've coined it. It's a little bit, it doesn't feel quite right, but visualization as a service and migration as a service. Effectively make it more self-service. That's what we're doing. So the idea is that you could log on and register and download. We currently have a desktop version of HubScope, but also there's a browser version coming out in the new year where you can basically use HubScope without the involvement of the services team at HubScope, especially in the data migration field, because you've already got the data. So we have an agent which is secure, which you download. You can then point that at a database or a number of databases, and it will visualize that, and it then provides the roadmap for how you then migrate from that data. So the reason we're starting with that profiler is it's the decision point as to whether that data is useful in the legacy system, which would trigger whether you needed to do a data migration of that, which then leads to visualizing the integration. So we've tried to make that a very low, a very simple thing to install, but high value, but low services. So the idea of self-service is very strong now in the company, and we're based on customer feedback. We've built a self-service site that people can register and start to use these capabilities as we release them, basically, rather than the download approach that we had with the likes of Ministry of Justice, which is a secure desktop, which is continuing to be their preferred approach because of the sensitivity of their network. They don't want that information about how all of their systems connect together to be outside of the organization. So there's always a place, as far as I can see, for a secure desktop. But I think for the mainstream clients that we're now looking for, we need a browser version, and it needs to be self-service. There's a few slides here on migration. I won't go into them. It's just showing really there are lots of dependencies to do with data migration, from understanding the source system and mapping it to the target system. And I actually find this whole area really interesting because you get to talk to lots of different stakeholders. You get to deal with the new vendor of the new system, and you add a lot of value in understanding how the old system works, because usually the vendors of the old system have long gone. And there's a lot of frustration in the organization around how they can get value from the data in the old system, but transition from the old system application to the new one. So there's kind of a lot of dynamics to it, but it does lend itself really well to visualizing the dependencies between things. This is just about the profiler. So to find out more, look at hubscope.com. It's sort of a broad view of the visualization that we've got, and hubscope.io is the self-service site. It's quite limited at the moment, but certainly something to see. Go and have a look at that. But you can't yet register. In the new year, you'll be able to register and download an agent, which then will gather metadata from different databases and then give you a browser that will visualize that using Tom Sawyer Software in the new year. But yeah, that's where we're at the moment. Fully committed to continuing to work with Tom Sawyer Software, largely because I just don't have the time or the technical team to build the sort of stuff that you've got, and you're continuing to enhance your platform. So I'm hoping we go from strength to strength. Yep.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. We appreciate our partnership with you very much.